that. I don't know. Like,
So today we're gonna be looking at Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation.
indicates that we're in the middle of a mental health crisis.
And you know what? Let's look into it right now.
These individuals, if I showed you
And
them in isolation without the knowledge of the context in which they are making these statements, you would think that these individuals are mentally ill. And if we're looking at these
untold contributions to our country,
and the
but we need to ensure that immigration is done legally for both the safety of our country and to preserve respect for the rule of law. The chaos of the last 4 years was unsustainable, and it was dangerous. We had 10 million individuals flood across our southern border. We had millions of undocumented individuals take up residence in our country, more than the population of a number of U.S. states. Law enforcement officials were overwhelmed, and officers were pulled off of the essential work of guarding the border just to process the flood of migrants. Border cities and other cities across the United States struggled to deal with the influx. And all of this chaos was an invitation to terrorists, to drug cartels, and other dangerous individuals to enter our country. And so I am tremendously proud and grateful for the incredible amount of work the president has done so far to make it clear that illegal migration will no longer be tolerated. Mr. President, there's a lot more work to do. And some of that's going to require Congress's help. Mr. Holman, President Trump's border czar, made clear to senators yesterday that Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement are going to need additional resources to continue the good work they've been doing to secure our border and to get criminals off of our streets. And we intend to deliver. Today, Senator Lindsey Graham, the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, is kicking off a committee markup of a budget resolution that will lay the foundation for a transformational investment in border security and immigration enforcement and in our national defense. We will provide resources to increase the number of immigration and customs enforcement officers and Border Patrol agents, expand detention space, facilitate deportations of dangerous individuals, and obtain the barriers and technology that we need to secure the border. Mr. President, for too long, our country has tolerated rampant illegal immigration. That ends now. I'm grateful for everything the president is doing to protect our streets and uphold the law, and the Republican-led Congress will ensure that the administration has the resources needed to continue this important work. Mr. President, in a few minutes, we're going to be voting on a couple of nominees. The first one is Tulsi Gabbard to be the director of the DNI. The second one will be a cloture vote to proceed to the nomination of Kennedy to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Now, what I observe that's interesting about both of these nominees is that both are former Democrats. In fact, a year ago, they were Democrats. I would argue they've seen the light, they've become Republicans, and now they've been nominated by President Trump to fill important posts within his administration. But I make that observation only because there's a lot of talk these days about loyalty oaths and allegiance and saliva purity tests for people to be considered, good enough to be in the so-called MAGA movement, in other words, the Republican Party. And yet, when it comes to Democrats, a very different standard seems to be being applied here. Because both of these people were former Democrats. In fact, frankly, they probably agree with the Democrat Party here in the Senate on a lot of the positions that they hold. And yet, they had the temerity to come out and support positions that perhaps ran contrary to some of the positions held by particularly the progressive wing of the Democrat Party in this country. In the case of RFK, coming out for some positions that run counter to the orthodoxy of the healthcare so-called establishment. Or in the case of Ms. Gabbard, different views perhaps about national security matters. than those held by a lot of Democrats, certainly here in this chamber and in the progressive movement in the country. And it harkens back to two other Democrats who pretty much got pushed out of their party here in the United States Senate for holding views that ran contrary to the majority view of the progressive wing of the Democrat Party. Those two Democrats were Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. In the case of Kyrsten Sinema, she was viewed, I think, by Democrats as perhaps too free market. She was viewed as pro-business, as pro-investment, and as pro-jobs, lighter regulatory touch, lighter tax policy, pro-energy policy. In the case of Joe Manchin, he had progressed, I should say, he had what I would say are accurate views with respect to energy development in this country. In other words, making America energy dominant, a view shared by many in our party, including our president. And for that, he was viewed as too conservative to be a true Democrat. And so Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema ended up getting pushed out of the Democrat Party here in the United States Senate. Now, their ultimate cardinal sin, however, in the case of Manchin, he said he was pro-energy in a party that is dominated by climate, green, all those, however adjectives you want to use to characterize or describe it. His views ran contrary. In fact, he tried to cut a deal with the Democrats in the Inflation Reduction Act, only to find out that they kind of went back on him, and the deal wasn't what he thought he had agreed to. So his views were out of the mainstream of the Democrat Party, as were Kyrsten Sinema's. But their cardinal sin, Mr. President, their cardinal sin was that they voted against getting rid of the legislative filibuster, a view that was held by, just a few years ago, a majority of Democrats here in the United States Senate. There was a letter signed, which I shared the other night, had 32 Democrat signatures on it, pleading with the leadership here in the Senate not to abandon the Senate tradition and heritage with respect to the filibuster, to maintain the heritage and the tradition that the Senate has for open debate and for representation of the minority, for the requirement for collaboration and bipartisanship when it comes to moving consequential legislation. Those are the things that the filibuster traditionally was about. And up until a few years ago, most of my colleagues on the other side, a majority on the other side, signed a letter articulating their views that that ought to be the position of the United States Senate. Well, they tried to push it because they weren't getting the outcomes they wanted on a couple of pieces of legislation when they had the majority a couple of years ago, and they forced a vote on changing the rules, breaking the rules, to get rid of the legislative filibuster and be able to enact an agenda that's more consistent with their liking. There were two people that voted against it on their side, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. And for that cardinal sin, they were essentially ostracized. And to this day, Mr. President, the Democrat Party continues to hold a position now, very contrary to the one they held just a few years ago, about getting rid of the legislative filibuster. And why do they want to do that? Because they want to enact an agenda, a progressive leftist agenda, which the American people voted against in November. And as recently as last summer at the Democrat convention, the Democrat leader basically laid out the things they want to do. First, he said, we're going to get rid of the filibuster because we have the votes now. Manchin and Sinema are gone. I've talked to the Democrats that we think we're going to elect, and we're going to have 51. And at that time, he was predicting a clean sweep. They were going to win the House, the Senate, and the White House. And they would get rid of the legislative filibuster, and the first thing they would do is they'd federalize our elections in this country. That'd be the first thing they were going to do. And then they said they were going to enshrine abortion rights in law. That was one of the things they were going to do. There have been many on their side who have talked about packing the Supreme Court, about allowing statehood for Puerto Rico and for Washington, D.C., all elements of the agenda that they want to accomplish through getting rid of the legislative filibuster. That was articulated by the Democrat leader as recently as the Democrat convention last summer. Intentions that they had to get rid of the legislative filibuster so that their party is in control, that they could do the things that they wanted to do, they felt that the American people were asking them to do. Well, it turns out there was an election between last summer and now in which the American people spoke otherwise. And they had a very different view than the Democrats on a whole range of issues. Issues on which I think the left and the Democrat Party is completely out of step with the American people. Not the least of which is allowing boys to play girls' sports. That's a 90% issue with the American people. The House has passed legislation on it. We will vote on it at some point in the future. And I just can't imagine, and I speak as a dad of daughters who were both female athletes, so one of whom is in her high school and college Hall of Fame. I don't know how anybody, and this is where I say, I think that there's just a certain intuitive common sense the American people have. And they voted for that and made that abundantly clear in the election this last fall. And so I say that, again, just to remind people, when you hear this perspective about how Republicans don't have any room for dissent, they all got to be in lockstep. Believe me, we got a lot of dissent on our side. Try leading the Republican conference. The Democrats, on the other hand, you have a dissenting view, particularly on something like the filibuster. Sorry, you're out of here. And so, Mr. President, today, it's ironic to me that we are going to vote on two nominees, President Trump's nominees, to be Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services and to be the Director of National Intelligence, who are former Democrats. And I will be surprised. I would like to be surprised. But I don't believe that there's going to be a single Democrat that votes for either of the two people who less than a year ago were members of their party. In some cases, members of their party that goes back decades. The Kennedy family, Democrat politics in America. So you have two nominees who were Democrats a year ago, but because they articulate views now or demonstrated dissent from the ideology of the Democrat Party, are no longer can get even one Democrat to vote for him here on the floor of the United States Senate. Now, again, I'm hoping to be surprised. That vote's going to happen in about 30 minutes on Tulsi Gabbard to be Director of National Intelligence. And then shortly after that, we'll have a cloture vote on Robert F. Kennedy to be Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. In each of those cases, you got Democrats in good standing, as recently as a year ago, who have been pushed out, come now, they're nominees by President Trump for positions within his administration, and you're not going to see a single Democrat vote for them. But we will confirm them, and we'll get these people into these positions as soon as possible. And in answer, I think, the mandate that was given by the American people in November, and that is they want a different track in this country, a different direction. They have a different set of priorities than is being articulated here on the United States Senate. Mr. President, we also had just recently a vote on Laken Riley, and that was probably the most glaring example, again, of Democrats' willingness to filibuster, something they wanted to get rid of 2 years ago. They want to get rid of the legislative filibuster. We get the majority. First time we put a bill on the floor, what do? They filibuster it. And so here we are, slowing down these noms, full 30 hours on Tulsi Gabbard. I assume they'll do the same thing on RFK. But these are people that are going to be confirmed and going to begin working in this administration to implement the agenda that the President of the United States has articulated and the one that he carried to the voters in this last election, in an election in which the voters gave him a decisive majority at the polls. And so, Mr. President, I hope, again, that I'm wrong. I hope that we have a bipartisan vote today on either or both of these nominees. But I will tell you that based on my assessment of where the party is, the Democrat Party in this country, it would come as a great surprise to me if that's the case. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Democrat leader.
Mr. President, let me begin with a quote from President Trump during his campaign for the presidency. He said, "When I win, I will immediately bring prices down starting on day one."
to reorienting our healthcare approach and restoring faith in our institutions. His passion for addressing America's chronic disease epidemic will save lives, reduce costs, and establish a foundation for a healthier, stronger country. His dedication to transparency will empower patients to make more informed decisions about their health care and form a responsive rapport with Congress. As Mr. Kennedy stated during his hearing, if Congress asks me for information, you will get it immediately. Over the course of his vetting process, Mr. Kennedy met with dozens of members on both sides of the aisle, spoke with bipartisan Senate Finance Committee staff, appeared before 2 committee hearings, and answered over 900 questions for the record. Not to mention presenting dozens of pages of documents. Mr. Kennedy has gone through the same Office of Government Ethics process as all nominees who come before the Finance Committee and has received support for his efforts. Similar to all other nominees, we have a letter from the Director of the Office of Government Ethics stating, based thereon, we believe that this nominee is in compliance with applicable laws and regulations governing conflicts of interest. He even amended his ethics agreement, going beyond what was required by the Office of Government Ethics in response to the request from one of our Finance Committee members. I urge my colleagues to join me in advancing this nomination
and our intelligence operations throughout the country and the world. I yield the floor. Absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
For questions about. He also refused to give up his 10% stake in any settlement agreements, instead passing them off to his son. And he refused to recuse himself from taking any actions that might affect his family's financial interest. A vaccine that has become routine for young people about 20 years ago was involved here, and since then, it's successfully cut cervical cancer rates into just a fraction of what they were before the drug came to market. All of this adds up to a future HHS secretary who stands to profit off undermining this vaccine and as a result raise cervical cancer rates. To quote my Republican colleague, Senator Cassidy, a physician, Mr. Kennedy is financially vested in finding fault with vaccines. He also played a big role in one of the most deadly measles outbreaks in recent history. In 2019, he traveled to Samoa and used his platform to promote his anti-vax agenda, taking aim at the measles vaccine. The vaccine rate in Samoa plummeted. By 2019, measles had torn through the entire population, making more than 5,700 people sick, and 80 people were killed, most of them young kids. During his confirmation hearing at the Senate Finance Committee, Mr. Kennedy told me, and I quote, "We don't know what was killing them," speaking about those 83 deaths. But just last week, the Director General of the Health of Samoa called this claim by Mr. Kennedy, and I quote here, "a total fabrication." So, Mr. President and colleagues, just put that in your thinking about this consideration. Mr. Kennedy saying that he didn't know what was killing these young people in Samoa, and the Director General of the Health of Samoa called Mr. Kennedy's claim a total fabrication. A recent analysis showed that Mr. Kennedy has made 114 separate appearances in the last 4 years where he took anti-vaccine views or spread misinformation about the efficacy of the vaccines. In 36 of these instances, Mr. Kennedy directly linked vaccines to autism. Instead of providing the committee with clarity or reassurances about his decades-long career peddling of vaccine conspiracies, what did Mr. Kennedy do? He dodged, he weaved, he bobbed, and gave no indication that as Health and Human Services Secretary, he would stand by settled science that surrounds vaccines. As HHS Secretary, Mr. Kennedy would have a huge amount of control over how vaccines are promoted and administered in our country. He could issue orders that discourage doctors from sharing information with parents and patients about life-saving vaccines. He could issue an order that discourages schools from talking about or even requiring vaccines. He could rubber stamp an executive order from Donald Trump that defunds the Centers for Disease Control, which is essentially the agency in charge of getting Americans up-to-date information about vaccines and when to get them. Just imagine you're a parent scrolling on Instagram or listening to a podcast. You hear this gentleman speaking passionately about the danger of vaccines. Maybe you do a bit of research, and lo and behold, you find this is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, America's chief healthcare guy. You think to yourself, this guy must know what he's talking about. Maybe he's right when he's questioning if vaccines are safe and effective. So the seed of doubt on vaccines gets planted. And then at your kid's next wellness exam, you decide not to get them their next round of vaccinations. A few months later, you're taking them on a trip to Disneyland, say for spring break, where countless other parents like you have heard the same medical advice from the same person, and you too decided against vaccinating your kids. It only takes one of those kids carrying a deadly disease like measles for an outbreak to begin. And pretty soon, after what was supposed to be the spring break trip of your dreams, your kid, sadly, is showing symptoms. What follows then is a slew of doctor's appointments, maybe even a stay in the hospital, sleepless nights, missed days of work and school, not to mention dread and fear for your child's very well-being. Meanwhile, countless other parents around the country that went on the same trip to Disneyland are now experiencing the same exact nightmare you are. Sowing the seed of doubt in the minds of just a few people can have massive consequences for communities across the country. And it is not hypothetical. Right now, there's a measles outbreak in Texas that sickened more than a dozen kids. The number of kindergartners showing up with an exemption for required vaccinations jumped to a record high last fall. The two facts are connected, and Mr. Kennedy and his allies can take the credit for it. Now, Mr. Kennedy is fond of saying he's not making recommendations about whether parents should vaccinate their kids. He's just asking questions and giving people choices. That's a slippery tactic used by conspiracy theorists to dodge any real responsibility for their words and actions, and it's absurd coming from somebody who's about to be confirmed for a job that is entirely about making recommendations. Mr. Kennedy is also fond of saying that if somebody shows him the science to prove he's wrong, well, then he'll apologize and retract his statements. But when somebody does show him the science proves him wrong, he just brushes it aside and basically will not accept it as fact. Once again, to quote my Republican colleague Bill Cassidy directly, to improve the health of Americans or undermine it, always asking for more evidence and never accepting the evidence that's there. That's why Bill Cassidy told Mr. Kennedy he was struggling with his nomination. So even Republicans like Senator Cassidy, someone I work with frequently on the Finance Committee and respect his opinion, he knows how dangerous this guy is. And it is not hyperbole to say that when Mr. Kennedy becomes Health and Human Services Secretary, if he does, and has control over how our government rolls out vaccines or make them available, I believe kids in America will die. And when disease rates for illnesses that have effective vaccines start to rise in states across the country, and hospitalizations and death tolls mount, my Republican colleagues are going to regret voting, if they do, for Mr. Kennedy today or early this morning. And when disease rates for illnesses that have effective vaccines start to rise in states across the country and death tolls, mount, again, we will see Republicans say, this is something that could have been prevented. What else should we have done? Republicans will be responsible for every child that dies as a result of not being vaccinated, because it seems they care more about staying in the good graces of Donald Trump than they do about protecting the lives of kids. Again, this is something they will regret for years to come. Now, before we turn to Senator Murray's remarks, I'd just like to touch on Mr. Kennedy's stance on reproductive choice, an area where Senator Murray has been our leader for years and years in the Senate. In the lead up to and during his failed presidential campaign, Mr. Kennedy repeatedly claimed he supported a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. Less than a year ago, in an Instagram post on June 14th last year, he stated that he supports the emerging consensus in this country that abortion should be legal up to a certain number of weeks. Fast forward to his confirmation again at the Senate Finance Committee a few weeks ago. He was pressed repeatedly by Democrats about his stance on abortion. Instead of clarifying, Mr. Kennedy defaulted to a clearly rehearsed talking point that he repeated over and over again. Quote, "I agree with President Trump. Every abortion is a tragedy." While that answer doesn't give us much clarity, it's certainly telling. Mr. Kennedy has a long history of changing his stance on healthcare issue after healthcare issue to whatever position benefits him at the moment, as long as it earns him power or it earns him a paycheck. As far as I can tell, Mr. Kennedy will believe, or at least pretend to believe, whatever you want him to. He's willing to give up his principles and all of his beliefs that women and mothers are better equipped to make their own healthcare decisions than politicians. And it's all about, as we've talked about on this floor, staying in Donald Trump's orbit of power. While Mr. Kennedy recites rehearsed talking points on the subject, this is an issue that has had real, deadly consequences for women, as Senator Murray has said again and again. Donald Trump spent his first term packing the Supreme Court with right-wing extremists willing to rip away the reproductive freedoms guaranteed to us under Roe versus Wade. In the wake of the Supreme Court's gutting Roe, millions of women living in red states have had their reproductive freedoms ripped away from them, all due to Donald Trump. In the years since the overturn of Roe, there have been countless headlines about the consequences of these abortion bans. Women bleeding out in parking lots or in emergency rooms because they were denied care. Women becoming infertile and losing their ability to have kids in the future because they couldn't get care. And in the very worst cases, women dying. So it should horrify every American that we don't actually know where Mr. Kennedy stands. The man who could become our nation's chief healthcare officer, we don't know where he stands on reproductive health, short of perhaps just saying he's a yes man for anything Donald Trump tells him to do. So I think at this point, Mr. President, I want to yield the floor to my friend and colleague from Washington State, because she knows so much about the challenge of ensuring that women's reproductive health services are being protected. And as Secretary of Health and Human Services, Mr. Kennedy could do so much damage to the well-being and health of women. And I'm very pleased to be able to yield the floor to her to discuss that and other pressing issues.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you to my colleague from Oregon, who has very clearly stated why this nominee is not someone who should be holding the title of Secretary of Health and Human Services. And I appreciate all of his work on this and his wise words. I hope everyone heeds them. Mr. President, the American people are watching now with alarm because the vast majority of people know vaccines are safe, they're effective, they are life-saving. But we are now on the verge of confirming as our nation's highest health official, a man who has spent considerable time, money, and effort undermining that basic fact. A man who has abused his platform by refusing to acknowledge the well-established science that shows that vaccines are not linked to autism. Fear about that point, fueled by RFK Jr. and others peddling misinformation, is a leading reason that parents do not get their kids vaccinated against preventable, dangerous diseases. That is why elevating a man like RFK Jr. to lead HHS would be so dangerous. Just giving him any platform to spread vaccine doubt is dangerous, but to give him one of the biggest megaphones in the world, it is truly shameful that we even are debating this. My colleagues should know better. They actually do know better. They are looking the other way. They are choosing to pretend like it is in any way believable that RFK Jr. won't use his new to do exactly the thing he has been trying to do for decades, undermine vaccines. Never mind the fact that CDC has already modified web pages with information about vaccines and other vital public health information which a federal judge has now ordered the Trump administration to restore it. Never mind that the Trump administration is also reportedly planning widespread and significant layoffs at CDC and across HHS. This is how RFK Jr. substitutes his own beliefs for science. So when the vaccine conspiracy starts swirling and RFK Jr. turns HHS into ground zero for misinformation, I had no idea it is not going to be an excuse for confirming him, because at the Health Committee hearing, the chair pressed him repeatedly about the debunked claim that vaccines cause autism. And when RFK Jr. said he needed to see the evidence, he was shown the evidence. But to no one's surprise, he did not keep his word, admit he'd been wrong, and spread the good news that vaccines do not cause autism. He's had 2 weeks since that hearing to look at the same settled science as everyone else. Crickets. But he won't hesitate to quote the latest anti-vax conspiracy. He's totally up to speed on that front. Are my colleagues really buying this guy will take an impartial look at the science? If you think RFK Jr. will change who he is, you are lying to yourself. He has given no evidence to suggest that and all the evidence in the world to the contrary. Given his long and growing track record, we cannot just pretend if RFK Jr. finally gets power to undermine vaccines, a cause he has dedicated a considerable amount of time and effort to, that he'll just give up. That is not believable. And I know I've been talking a lot about vaccines because it is so obviously alarming. But the responsibility he would have goes far beyond that. So let's break some of this down. Both the ways he could undermine vaccines as HHS secretary and the other responsibilities that would be at stake. To start with, the CDC is under HHS. That means that the secretary directly appoints people to CDC's Vaccine Advisory Board. That board is responsible for making recommendations about vaccines, and it is those recommendations that determine whether or not certain vaccines have to be covered by insurance. So simply put, changing those recommendations will change what vaccines millions of Americans, including kids, will be able to get from their healthcare provider. If he is confirmed, there would be nothing stopping RFK Jr. from firing the entire board and replacing them all with vaccine skeptics. After all, he has said many times and in many ways, he thinks CDC is corrupt and bought by pharma, as usual, by the way, without any evidence. RFK Jr. would also oversee the Food and Drug Administration. That is another agency he has repeatedly tried to discredit and attack, where he says he plans to fire hundreds of scientists on day one, and an agency that plays the crucial role of making sure our drugs and our treatments, including vaccines, are safe and effective when we purchase them. Not only would Mr. Kennedy have a key perch from which he would undermine vaccines on a scale like never seen before, he could also use that platform to peddle quack treatments, no basis in science. RFK Jr. would also have jurisdiction over NIH. That alone means influence over billions of dollars in medical research, research that is responsible for a significant portion of our economy, and more importantly, research that patients are desperately hoping will help them find cures. But RFK Jr. could redirect those funds to promote his favorite pet conspiracies instead of promising cures. Or he could make good on his plan to fire hundreds of researchers and pause infectious disease research for 8 years. It should go without saying, viruses aren't going to take a break. And here's the thing, the attacks on medical research are now already happening under Trump. From his day one executive orders, President Trump has already been threatening medical research. Suddenly, all of our grants are at risk because they are looking at addressing barriers to care or understanding why Black and Native American women have higher maternal death rate. And now President Trump also is trying to illegally, arbitrarily, and suddenly change NIH guidelines to set an unrealistic low cap on indirect cost rates. That will mean researchers laid off, studies canceled, including life-saving clinical trials, and kids not able to get the treatment they need. All because President Trump and Elon Musk don't seem to understand how we actually fund important research and couldn't even be bothered to find out before taking an axe to our medical research labs. At a time when life-saving research like this is already under attack from President and the richest man in the world, no one who truly values medical research should vote to install one of the biggest attackers of medical science as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Mr. President, insurance is another huge portfolio for HHS. Last time Trump was in office, we saw millions of people lose their healthcare coverage. The uninsured rate went up after years of hard-won progress. And we all know he still wants to rip up the Affordable Care Act, which will drive up costs and kick people off their coverage. There's no reason to think Mr. Kennedy will stand up to that effort. Indeed, there is no reason to think he has the experience and understanding of the system to actually do so. During his committee hearings, RFK Jr. confused Medicare and Medicaid. This is basic stuff. He failed to describe the components of Medicare. And yes, Mr. President, I do absolutely have to talk about abortion care. This is of grave importance right now. In his hearings, not only did RFK Jr. confess to having no real understanding of EMTALA, that is a law which requires patients have access to life-saving emergency care, including, in some cases, abortion care. He also showed that he will be totally open to Republicans' fact-free efforts to rip away access to medication abortion. Like so many other issues that RFK Jr. is simply wrong about, the science on that has been settled for many years now. Mr. Kennedy made clear, though, he's very open to revisiting access to the abortion pill based on a Republican argument against the science that basically boils down to nah. Putting up barriers to accessing the abortion pill or ripping it off the market completely, as Republicans have made very clear they want to do, would be absolutely devastating. And let's not forget about pandemic threats. The lies that RFK Jr. spread during the last pandemic already make clear he is not the man to do this job. But if that weren't enough, when there was a pandemic threat response planning session for this new administration, he skipped it. He didn't go. It would be almost comical if this wasn't so serious. Mr. President, everywhere you look, everything about this nominee is so concerning. We cannot take this man at his word, something he has changed and gone back and forth on time and time again, but we can take him on his record, which is that he has consistently undermined vaccine confidence. And by the way, note, he profited from that. And we can take the threat of what he might do seriously, especially given the alarming things that are already happening. If RFK Jr. gives you his word of honor that he won't freeze research, guess what? We're already seeing the Trump administration totally upend medical research. Thanks to the Trump funding freeze, NIH hasn't issued any grants award in weeks. If RFK Jr. swears that he's not going to take down information about vaccines, he's not going to silence experts, well, don't look now. But the Trump administration has already taken down or changed CDC pages about vaccines. They have already silenced public health experts. If RFK Jr. pinky promises you that he won't undermine medical science or studies or and he won't ignore global health threats, well, you might want to sit down for this, but President Trump has completely demolished our global health aid work. He has already completely demolished it. The fallout is utterly heart-wrenching. Already we know of a woman who died because the USAID supported hospital she went to for oxygen was forced to discharge her because they got a stop work order from the Trump administration. It's not clear if she was the first death caused by Trump's complete freeze, but there is no question she will not be the last. And Mr. President, let me make a really important point here. It is not just people across the world who will be affected by this. There was a study being done on a new HIV treatment with thousands of volunteers. Study being done, already having 1,000 volunteers doing the treatment. But now, without their regular injections, which are cut off by Trump's move, there's going to be too little of the drug in their system to protect those people from HIV, but enough of the drug that if they contract HIV, it could mutate to become drug resistant. So for all the absolutely unhinged conspiracies we've heard about medical research from RFK Jr. and the like, where is the concern of this actual risk in this actual study happening right now, all because President Trump cut off foreign assistance? RFK Jr. has been silent about that risk, silent about how wrong that is. And so even as he is making these empty promises on one hand to some of our colleagues, he's already standing by as President Trump breaks them on the other hand. Oh, and here's one more. If RFK Jr. says he's going to consult you on healthcare personnel, please do not be fooled. Look, I don't know why my colleagues need me to tell them this. I like to think we have some pretty smart people around here. But this vote, RFK Jr.'s own nomination, this is your consultation on healthcare personnel, not some made-up promise for later. This is the point you have the most power. Whatever he might say, you don't get to choose who RFK Jr. will appoint to this or that. Heck, he doesn't get to choose who President Trump appoints. The decision you get to make, all of us on this floor get to make, is the decision before us right now. You get to choose who you vote to confirm, and you will have to live with that decision. And if you ignore the warning signs and confirm RFK Jr., then when the wheels fall off the wagon, you may try to tell yourself you were lied to, but you knew who you were dealing with. You knew who you were dealing with. You knew what he said before and what he has refused to say. You had all the knowledge you needed to do the right thing. I cannot tell my colleagues enough, this is not a game. This is not a political role without consequence. The health secretary has real power over whether Americans can get basic information and care that impacts whether they live or die. As I have tried to drive home throughout this process, vaccines save lives. That is not a question. It is not a slogan. It is a fact. If when parents look to you, worried about their newborn, wanting to do what is best for their baby, and trusting your advice as a public health leader, if you cannot tell them the same truth that centuries of science and experience tells us, which is that vaccines are safe and effective and life-saving, then you have absolutely no business leading the Department of Health and Human Services, none. And so just as I did at the hearing, I want to warn all of my colleagues, by merely voting to confirm Mr. Kennedy, we would be telling our constituents he's worth listening to on vaccines. That alone will get people killed before he even lifts a finger, because he does not even need the levers of power to get people killed. All he needs is that megaphone to affirm his views. By voting to confirm him as our highest health official, let's not mince words about what that will mean. When babies die from whooping cough because parents weren't sure if the vaccine was safe, will you be able to look them in the eye? When the flu sweeps our nursing homes, when measles sweep through our communities, will it be worth it? Mr. President, I will end on this. I'm sure there are plenty of members who know perfectly well just how dangerous it would be to confirm RFK Jr. They don't need to hear it from me. In fact, some of them even know the danger better than I do. But here's what I do know. Conscience is a muscle. Courage is a muscle. The less you use them, the more they fade away. So if my colleagues are feeling the pressure from President Trump, or if they're feeling the weight of the richest man in the world on their backs on this vote, I would warn them. This will certainly not be the last test we face here in the Senate. Giving into this pressure now won't make it go away. It won't soften the pressure you face later, and it will not strengthen your resolve when the stakes are higher. It will just show pressure works. If you do not draw a line somewhere, you will cross every line you could ever imagine. You will be pushed further and further into accepting things you thought you never would, things you thought you never could. I think most of my colleagues know what really is at stake here. I think most of my colleagues know what sort of man RFK Jr. is and what sort of damage he could do if he's confirmed. There are political realities, we all get that, but there is also right and wrong. There's fact and fiction. There's people staying healthy and people dying pointlessly, kids dying pointlessly from diseases that we can prevent because they thought Congress took its job vetting our healthcare secretary seriously. So, Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to show some courage. I urge them to show some conscience. I urge them to vote no on RFK Jr.'s nomination. Mr. President, I yield 30 minutes of post-cloture debate time to the Democratic leader, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. I find it so interesting how people are watching so closely to see what this administration does. And I've been so pleased to see that the polling shows by an overwhelming amount, 70% of the American people agree with how President Donald Trump is carrying out his job, getting things done for the American people, things that they voted to see done. And he is keeping those promises. Now, when we look at the issue of illegal immigration, we see that in his first weeks back in office, what he has done at the top of his to-do list has been to take action to secure this border. The numbers that we are seeing, how they have dropped with the number of encounters, with the number of gotaways, this is encouraging. The message is out there. The U.S. is going to protect and defend its sovereignty. We are going to protect and defend our people. That is important, and we are seeing it. Now, the president has taken some executive actions that have yielded results. By executive order, he restored the Remain in Mexico policy. He restarted the border wall construction, which, by the way, Mr. President, this is something the Border Patrol has told us not for just a few years, but for decades. We need a border wall. That's where the phrase, build the wall, came from. It came from people that are down there every day protecting this country from harm. The president has also ended catch and release. Now, that's that practice where somebody comes across and then they get their paper that they're claiming asylum and they're told that they can go on into the country and go wherever, and there are nonprofits down there on the border, and they give them a plane ticket and food and a phone, and off they go to their desired destination at taxpayer expense. So that has ended. The president has also sent troops to the southern border, and thank goodness we are seeing these deportations of criminal illegal aliens taking place. Yesterday in Nashville, we had 8 that were apprehended in a human trafficking ring. 8. 2 of them were linked to Tren de Agua. They were Tren de Agua gang members. Now, these are all things that the president is doing to make this country safe. And we have security moms all across this country. and certainly across Tennessee that are reaching out to us and saying, keep it going, deport those that are criminally in this country. Let's carry this out. We're seeing such good results. In operations across the country, ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has arrested 11,000 criminal illegal aliens, including many violent offenders and gang members. Since Inauguration Day, migrant encounters at the southern border have reportedly dropped.
Yeah, I was kind of like a little bit confused about. I think the other lady was lying about RFK Jr. a little bit. I think she was kind of gaslighting, you know. And the other guy was gaslighting as well too. You know. But let's keep watching.
Dropped 87%. As I said, Mr. President, we are seeing results. We know that for years, former President Biden allowed more than 10 million illegal aliens to enter the country, including tens of thousands of convicted criminals and more than 1.7 million known gotaways. And for 4 years, Tennesseans and Americans across the country have suffered the tragic consequences, including rampant migrant crime. Recently, our Tennessee District Attorneys General Conference released a report documenting the widespread migrant crime in our state during the final months of the Biden administration. Now, the report confirms what we already know, that during the Biden years, every town was a border town, every state was a border state. So our Tennessee District Attorneys General took the last 3 months of 2024, and they said, let's look at what is happening in these last 3 months and see how this has escalated. Now, of course, we know that under Joe Biden, violent crime rose 43% his first year that he was in office. And what we saw from the District Attorney General's report, that there were in 3 months, now this is a 3-month number, there were 2,719 reports of illegal aliens being charged or convicted of 3,854 offenses in the state of Tennessee. Among them, the most common offense was driving under the influence. There were 654 arrests of those illegally in the country driving under the influence. These offenses accounted for more than 13% of all DUI arrests across the entire state. And why last year, my Republican colleagues and I introduced the Protect Our Communities from DUIs Act. This bill would automatically deport any illegal alien who is charged with driving under the influence. Mr. President, as I have gone across our state, in each of our 95 counties, which I visit every year, into each of these counties, I have heard from law enforcement, from police chiefs, from sheriffs. Are such an incredible problem, and the number that are committed by those illegally in the country. Now, over this same 3-month period, illegal aliens committed hundreds of violent, heinous crimes, 154 instances of domestic assault, 80 of aggravated assault, 21 convicted of child abuse, 9 of statutory rape, 8 of sexual exploitation of a minor, 7 of vehicular homicide, 4 of murder, 3 of rape of a child, and the list goes on and on. As I said, over 2,700 illegally in the country that were convicted of more than 3,800 crimes. Disturbingly, these numbers are likely an undercount. Only 73 of Tennessee's 95 counties reported data to the District Attorneys General Conference. Under Biden, national data showed that illegal aliens were pouring in from countries all over the world. And the Tennessee Migrant Crime Report also reflects this. There were 92 unique countries of origin from Mexico and Guatemala, Jamaica, Romania. Here's the bottom line. Because
So basically, that's part one of Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation. So we're going to end it on that note. You guys will be back tomorrow with part 2. We're going to finish this out. This is 11 hours long. So, yeah, we're going to finish this whole thing out. So, anyways, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you later.